energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India and there's certain key things that they want from us.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Normally, you and I'd be trying to make some sort of pun about how I'm going to be looking at my bingo card for PMQs. There is no PMQs today.
No, well, it's good we knew about this a long time ago, wasn't it?
We didn't, but that is essentially because the King's speech yesterday, of course, setting out the government's agenda, its legislative agenda for the next session of Parliament. That triggers a debate in the House of Commons on the King's speech, which is taking place today instead of PMQs. And as a result, the next Prime Minister's questions will be next Wednesday instead. The Prime Minister is actually out of London. He's gone to visit a school in Lincolnshire to talk about other issues and perhaps to put some flesh on the bones of some of the ideas that were put forward in yesterday's King's speech. We had a long chat with our reporter Alex Wickham yesterday about it, particularly the paucity of bills being laid out in this, and how perhaps if you were looking for some sort of great inspiration about how the Conservative Party were hoping they might be able to make a bid to rival Labour in the next elections, that you weren't going to get any huge surprises out of it. You missed that conversation though. What did you make of the King's speech?
I mean, I don't think you would call it a sort of grand vision, would you? It was certainly a sort of interesting mix of proposals, but it's not sort of big stuff on all the big issues of the day, but certainly some interesting eye-catching proposals. Lots of stuff on law and order. The North Sea oil and gas proposals, of course, to have annual drilling licences in the North Sea, hoping to create a bit of clear water with the Labour Party on that. Rental and leasehold reform, which has been ongoing. We saw some of that in the previous parliamentary session as well. And plans to ban young people from smoking. Anybody over the age of 14 perhaps will never be able to buy a cigarette. That's a measure which has a fair amount of cross-party support. And it's something which Rishi Sunak himself was particularly keen to bring in. The Mail's leader column was pretty damning, saying that many of the proposals were either insubstantial, trivial or narrowly technocratic.
Oof. No Oscars for this King's speech anyway, that's for sure. Of course, that's one of the issues that's being discussed in Westminster in the House of Commons as they debate the King's speech today. Other matters, though, going to be taking precedence to this continued row over the pro-Palestinian march that's due to take place this Saturday on Armistice Day. The Met Police Chief, given that the go-ahead, he's going to be meeting the Prime Minister later to talk about this.
Yeah, the Met Chief says that there's no intelligence indicating a serious threat to public order, and that would be required for the Met to ask the Home Secretary to ban Saturday's protests. So it's now really up to ministers to decide whether to invoke what would be pretty draconian powers to try to stop the march going ahead. There's certainly been loads of noises from the government and from Tory backbenchers about the unhappiness, the inappropriateness perhaps, of this march going ahead on Armistice Day, which happens to be on Saturday this year.
Yeah.
Health Secretary Steve Barclay said that the march is provocative and saying that I don't think it's the right day.
And of course, those organising the march say, look, they're not going to be anywhere near Whitehall. They're not going to be anywhere near the events taking place at the Cenotaph. The protests taking place in another part of London, and that they wouldn't seek to be disrupting any of those very solemn events that are taking place, of course, around Armistice Day, Remembrance Day as well. So that's sort of how that debate is still rumbling on. Mark Rowley is actually going to be speaking to the Institute of Government later on today, and we'll be discussing that with our UK political editor Kitty Donaldson coming up a little bit later in the programme. We're also going to be talking to her though about the row in the Labour Party over this issue. Yeah,
there's been a simmering row really over this, over the use of the word ceasefire. One of Starmer's shadow ministers, admittedly quite a junior one, Imran Hussein, has now quit the front bench, saying that Labour needs to go further and call for a ceasefire in the conflict. He says that a ceasefire is essential to ending the bloodshed and to ensuring that enough aid can pass into Gaza and to help ensure the safe return of Israeli hostages. Interestingly, Hussein is a member of the Socialist campaign group of left-wing MPs. Not many of those in Starmer's top team these days, but there have been plenty of resignations in Labour. This is the first one from the front bench, but we've seen over 25 councillors leaving Labour, and this is an issue which has been proved quite divisive. We've seen about a third of Labour MPs now roughly calling for a ceasefire, so that is not something something they've been banned from doing by Starmer, but it is not Starmer's position, and it is not the position of the shadow cabinet.
Yeah, and certainly it's definitely making his job as leader that much more complicated as well. We're going to turn back, though. We'll come back to that story in just a moment, but we're going to turn back to one of the things that the Prime Minister said yesterday after the King's speech. So King Charles laying out the government's legislative agenda, but Rishi Sunak followed up with this campaign-style video on social media trumpeting the progress that had been made towards achieving his 5 key pledges. Let's take a listen.
1 year ago, I stood on the steps of Downing Street and promised to deliver for the people of this country. Today, the results are clear. Inflation is down, easing the burden of the cost of living. The economy is growing and debt is falling.
Well, inflation is down, but it was those last few words which have raised a few eyebrows. Debt is falling. The Prime Minister went on to say that in Parliament that debt is set to fall and is on track to fall. But even that is still a few years away from playing out. In fact, Ben Zaranko, senior research economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, says it is not accurate to say the debt's falling. He told Bloomberg that public sector debt is currently rising in cash terms, in real terms, and most importantly, as a percentage of national income. Well, let's get the view of our own expert here, Bloomberg's senior UK economist, Dan Hanson. Dan, thanks for jumping into the studio rather quickly. What's your take on this? Is it true that debt is falling?
No.
Thank you very much.
To answer your question, am I done? Right now, I mean, what Ben Zarenko said there is absolutely correct. If you look at the latest data, of course, if you look at the OBR forecast in 5 years' time, so in 2027-28, their debt as a share of GDP is set to fall by a very, very small margin. But as I say, it is a very small margin. It's £6.5 billion, and of course that was done in a forecast that was done in March. A lot has changed since then. We'll get a new forecast from the OBR on November the 22nd. As things stand, is debt falling right now? No, it's not.
So is there any way that the government could claim the debt is falling? Is there any way that they could kind of look at it from a different way? They can kind of tweak the measures.
Can they massage these numbers, Dan? Is what we want to know.
That's what we want to know.
I don't think you can, to be honest with you. And I think in the current context as well of, debt, the sort of stock of debt as a share of income, or just the stock of debt, is one measure. But if you look at things like debt servicing costs, that is a really big issue now in the UK. That is rising at worrying rates. And one of the reasons why it's so important that we get debt falling as a share of income and bring borrowing down is that so the limited amount of cash we do have that's coming into the exchequer through tax receipts isn't going off to be spent on servicing debt. It's going on public services, which are obviously under a huge strain because of the rise in inflation that we've had. So, fundamentally, I don't think you can massage it in any way or cut it in any way. Over the course of time, though, the government has the benefit of a forecast in which it can make assumptions about what it will do with tax and spending, and the OBR has to take, which the OBR is the UK's fiscal watchdog, it has to take those assumptions. And so by the end of the forecast horizon, as I say, in March, and almost certainly in the upcoming forecast, debt will be on a downward trajectory. Debt as a share of GDP will be on a downward trajectory. The question is about how realistic or how plausible those assumptions that have been made about the path of spending in particular are, and whether that is ever going to be something that can be delivered.
And this is sort of an ongoing issue for governments as well, is because the fiscal rules determine that you have to have debt falling as a share of GDP over 5-year trajectory, which is one of the kind of adjustments that was made to the rules last year. But you can forever keep pushing back that deadline, I suppose. So in some ways, that's sort of how the politics and the economics tend to interact in this way, is that governments will always reassign their plans so that by the end of the 5 years you'll be there, but in the short term doesn't look so great. But I think the key point here is that we're getting to is that debt is not currently falling, and at the moment doesn't look like it's going to be falling to those levels either. How important is that on a broad scheme of things? You mentioned the debt repayments. That's a short-term issue as well. Lots of developed countries have very large debts.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, and it goes to 2 points. I mean, I sort of touched on it there in the previous answer, that what you don't want is if you say you have a pie, which is the tax take, what you don't want is an increasing share of that pie being taken up by debt interest payments, because you want money for public services, for public investment. That's where you want the money going, because that's where you get the economic returns. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that you always need a plan to put debt on a sustainable path. We found out in the autumn of last year what it's like when there isn't a plan and investors don't like the look of the fiscal strategy that you have. So it's very important as well for the sort of feedback loop of what you're saying about your fiscal stance and the trajectory of fiscal policy, the feedback that then has onto interest rates, because essentially you want to be credible and you don't want to have a risk premium built in to your debt, and because that, as I say, then feeds back onto higher debt interest payments and you get into this loop. So there are sort of two things. One is to ensure that you have money to spend on other things, and the second is to ensure that you're not sort of paying this risk premium in markets for the debt that you're issuing.
You mentioned the debt servicing, and of course that is a lot of the problem, isn't it? Is interest rates are so much higher. What was quite a sustainable level of debt suddenly feels like it's really uncomfortable, doesn't it? How did we get here? What's been the trajectory of UK debt looking back? Obviously, the pandemic was a big part of this, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back sort of from 1997 to now, there are sort of three or four sort of episodes, aren't there? So you had a very stable level of debt up until 2007. It was around 40% of GDP, maybe a little bit lower. Then had the financial crisis. We had this big step up in the level of debt, partly because of the hit to the economy, or a lot to do with the hit to the economy, but also because there was fiscal support put in place. And of course, when the economy weakens, the deficit widens. So you had those two effects playing out. Yuan, as you said, you had the pandemic. And in the interim there, the Conservative government did manage to get debt as a share of GDP falling. And sort of if you look in 2017, 2018, debt as a share of GDP did begin to move onto a downward trajectory. But then we had the pandemic. And of course, now we've had the cost of living crisis. So we've had these sort of big outlays, these big periods of fiscal support and these big economic shocks that have sort of essentially created these level shifts in the debt level as a share of income, and now we're up at nearly 90% of GDP for the debt as a share of GDP if you look at it excluding the Bank of England. So it's and as I say, it's risen from about 40% prior to the financial crisis. It's an awfully big rise that we've had.
Yeah, and something that we're watching, of course, here too. More broadly, we did also hear from the International Monetary Fund with their latest projections for economic growth across the whole of Europe, but they show the growth in the UK underperforming the euro area this year and next year. Did any of that come as a surprise to you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think the IMF they're sort of in the softish landing camp, aren't they? You've still got some growth next year. I mean, I think the government would look at those forecasts and be relatively encouraged, if I'm perfectly honest, about what's to come. But it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, if you look at, we've spoken about this sort of a lot over the recent past, but if you look at the recent performance of the economy, it's been one of sort of very modest growth, stagnation, and I think the IMF forecast says that's really what's going to continue over the next year or so. And
how does it compare to your forecasts?
So compared to ours, we're a little bit more pessimistic.
Surely not.
I'm not always a doom monger. We're a little bit more pessimistic. We do think there will be a contraction in a relatively prolonged contraction in the economy over the next year or so, or into the middle of 2024 is when we think the economy will start growing again. But if you look at it in sort of historical terms, the gap between what the IMF is saying and what we're saying, it isn't huge. The difference between this sort of stagnation scenario and this mild recession scenario that we have isn't that large. Nonetheless, we're a little bit more pessimistic about the outlook, and we'll get a look at what the economy is doing on Friday when we get 3Q GDP, and we'll get the sort of latest update on where we are then.
Okay, Dan Hanson, senior UK economist at Bloomberg Economics. Thank you so much for being with us in studio.
Now, as we mentioned a little bit earlier in the show, Labour leader Keir Starmer has lost a member of his shadow team over his position on the Israeli-Hamas war. Imran Hussein quitting as shadow minister for the New Deal for working people. Well, Bloomberg's UK political editor Kitty Donaldson is with us now. Kitty, why exactly did Hussein say that he's going?
He said he's going because he didn't feel that his position on whether there should be a ceasefire in Gaza was compatible with being a shadow minister in Keir Starmer's team. And this has kind of been brewing for a while. Lots of people have been expressing their view. And while the Labour Party leadership had said rank and file MPs in the parliamentary party could hold a view, they said anyone on the payroll, that means anyone who's got a shadow ministerial position, couldn't express their views freely. And so he's quit late last night in order to express his actual views.
This is the latest in a line of resignations, notably the most senior person to have resigned over this issue. But how much of an impact is this having on the Labour Party, and should we be expecting more resignations like this?
Well, that's an open question at the moment, actually. Starmer's lost quite a lot of councillors, I think about 30 in total, quite a lot in sort of Muslim areas like Bradford or areas where there are lots of Muslim people. Could Imran Hussein be the first of several? I think that is a question that they're actively considering in Starmer's office at the moment. But he's quite junior, let's say that. I mean, shadow minister for the New Deal isn't a proper job, to be honest. There is no minister for the New Deal in government. So it's embarrassing, but it's not as bad as someone in the shadow cabinet quitting. Let's just put it that way.
And it's also interesting to point out, I think, that he was a member of the Socialist campaign group, wasn't he? So they must be fairly thin on the ground in the top team at the moment. Or you say he's not really the top team, even in the middle team.
The middle team, yes, it's a very interesting point, actually. I've been trying to kind of catalogue how many people fall into that category with the kind of eye to what will happen after the election and how the kind of the left of the party, the status of the left of the party. And actually, quite a quick and easy way to do that is to look at who has signed this thing called an early day motion, which is basically like a parliamentary notice board, and you stick a bit of metaphorical paper on it and say, I think this, and then other people sign up below. And the kind of socialist left wing of the Labour Party have all signed an early day motion saying, we're calling for a ceasefire now. And I totted it up this morning, and there were about 37 maybe, Labour MPs on there, plus MPs from other parties, actually. So that kind of shows you the strength of the party. I think there are about 250 Labour MPs at the moment. So I don't know roughly what that is. Maybe a sixth of the party are in that position at the moment. But of course, the party will, after the election, if Starmer wins lots of seats, they'll be very much in his mould, these new MPs. So actually, the kind of socialist wing will probably be diluted even more.
How much will this resignation and the cumulative effect of the resignation so far put pressure on Keir Starmer?
There's no doubt that he is under pressure, and I think quite a lot of people on the front bench in shadow ministerial roles actively agree with people like Imran Hussein. Privately, they say things like Starmer's taken the wrong stance on Israel. This all kind of sparked off by an interview he gave on radio on the 11th of October, in which he sort of misspoke and appeared to back, this was later clarified, but he appeared to back the Israelis from not allowing water into Gaza or not allowing the pipes to be switched on. And since when he's been slightly on the back foot, basically, on this. And I think if he'd been clearer from the outset where the distinction lies, he might be in a better position now. But we are where we are, and the pressure is there. But it's sort of simmering, but not boiling, I would say.
And on that related row, which is more difficult for the government, that's over the march on Armistice Day, the pro-Palestinian march, which the police at the moment say can go ahead. How tricky is this for the government? Do you think they're going to move on this? Because it would be quite a step, wouldn't it, if they actually called on the police to stop this?
It absolutely would. And we understand that the Prime Minister's going to meet Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, today. There's been quite a lot of pressure from ministers. This morning, a couple were out on the airwaves saying, absolutely, the march is a provocation. It shouldn't take place. But the Met have so far resisted this, saying they haven't got the legal powers to stop it going ahead. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think, on a kind of side note, I think Saturday might turn nasty if you have a bunch of people who are pro-Palestine. And then you've got a bunch of kind of, there's some football supporters who are in a league against racism. They say they're going to come down and form a human shield around the cenotaph. Plus, then you've got the Lord Mayor's Show, which is the kind of ancient guildsman of London. That's the kind of pageantry thing going on in the city of London. So that's happening as well. Plus, you've got loads of football matches going on. So that's people pouring in and out on the trains. And then also possibly someone was telling me earlier that the British National Party might also have a march this weekend. So there's a bit of a cauldron going on there. So, watch the space.
Yeah, so all in all, an enormously challenging day for the police on Saturday. Kitty, thanks so much for bringing your thoughts on that. That's Kitty Donaldson, our UK political editor.
Well, think away from UK politics and thinking about the global politics. Global political and business leaders are in Singapore at Bloomberg's new economic forum. They've been thinking about some of the geopolitical tensions, the war in the Middle East being one, but also the war in Ukraine, with leaders expressing concerns about the dangers of what that might mean for global stability, but also for the global economy. We've been discussing this with Tom Orlik, who's chief economist at Bloomberg Economics, and a warning from the Singaporean foreign minister that this was a moment of danger for the world.
Well, that's certainly a perspective which is being shared here at the New Economy Forum in Singapore. You mentioned the view from the Singapore foreign minister, but I think there's a general tone running through a lot of the discussions here, which is a sort of tone of concern that this cycle is not just about inflation, it's not just about the Fed and the European Central Bank and the Bank of England having to jack up interest rates to control inflation. It's also about growing geopolitical risk. The trade war between China and the United States, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, conflict now between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. I think all of these are kind of adding to a sort of drumbeat of concern that perhaps this isn't a normal economic cycle. Perhaps geopolitical risk is here to stay.
Yeah, and of course it's notoriously difficult for investors to really think about that and to think how it affects their financial decisions. So I suppose how big a risk and what lens can we look through in terms of understanding the conflict in the Middle East when it comes to the economy?
So I think that's a really great question. And of course, you're completely right that markets are not good at pricing geopolitical risk. I don't think it's too much of an oversimplification to say that markets place basically no probability on geopolitical risks before they occur and then charge a very high premium for them when they do occur. So I think investors are still grappling with this. Now, focusing in on the Middle East conflict, of course, this is already a human tragedy. In terms of the global economic and market impact, as long as it is a conflict which remains narrowly confined to Gaza, I don't think the global market and economic impact is going to be especially marked. Indeed, it might even be invisible in the global aggregates. When we would start seeing those global economic and market impacts, well, that would be if this expands from a conflict narrowly confined to Gaza to a regional conflict between Israel and its old enemy, Iran. That's not where we are today. And based on discussions at the New Economy Forum, I don't think it's a risk which people are putting a very high probability on. But as the conflict continues and as temperatures continue to rise, it's not a risk that can be ruled out.
Tom, you've also been hearing from the Chinese Vice President there days before this meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. How significant could a warming of US-China relations be for both economies, but particularly for China, given all of the concerns that we've had about a slowdown there?
So it's interesting. In the last few months, we've seen the US send a number of senior policymakers, Blinken, Yellen, Raimondo, to Beijing. And now we have China's Vice President Han Zheng here at the New Economy Forum, delivering what I would consider to be a sort of a pretty constructive message. It was a message about a China that wants to continue to engage with the global economy, a China that wants to continue to engage with global business and global investors. And as you know, it comes just a few days before that planned meeting between President Biden and President Xi at APEC. So has something sort of structural changed in the US-China relationship? I don't think so. I think the intense rivalry and the suspicion is still there. But I think what we're seeing in the signaling from both Washington, D.C. and from Beijing is that they want stability. They don't want this to spiral down. I think the Han Zheng speech here at the NEF was part of that. And I think the hope for global investors is that we see that extended at the Xi-Biden meeting.
Well, that was our chief economist, Tom Orlik, speaking to Stephen and Caroline Hepker earlier from the New Economic Forum in Singapore. Interesting to get Tom's thoughts on geopolitics and the broader threats to markets and the global economy. Plenty more from the event in Singapore on Bloomberg TV and radio. That runs right through to Friday.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiba Adebayo and our audio engineer was Did Hussein. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.